Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London again with another watch review, and today we're looking at comparison between the Rolex GMT-Master II and the Rolex Submariner, both specifically in steel. If you haven't seen our reviews of these watches already, then go check them out. So let's look at some rough history behind both watches. The GMT was designed in 1950, or released in 1954 for pilots to be able to switch between time zones when traveling on long flights. The Submariner is designed for diving. It's a dive watch and it has a depth endurance to 300 meters. It shows you increments for decompression stops. It also shows you elapsed time on the bezel for how long you've been diving for. Both of them really easy to use and great for their purposes. So let's dive straight into the differences between these two watches. So the case is very similar on both of them. The Submariner was released in 1953 and then the GMT in 1954. And since then, the cases have remained pretty much exactly the same. The only tiny difference that I've noticed on the actual cases is the crown guards on the Submariner are slightly larger than the crown guards on the GMT, but that's all I noticed. The bezels are obviously the biggest difference on these watches, and you can see the 24-hour bezel you've got on the GMT and then your increment dive time on the Submariner. The numbers on the Submariner are much smaller than the numbers on the GMT, which I prefer, but I think the GMT has much more of a sporty look to it. The Submariner's got more of like a refined, subtle look. The dials are also kind of different, but pretty similar in general. Both of them have this sort of maxi dial look with the big indices, the big round indices and the triangles. Your date windows are identical. And one of the biggest differences on the dial is you have a fourth hand on the GMT, which is your GMT hand, which I really like, that sort of triangle look with the green. I think it's a really nice look. Both of these watches have lume on the hand, or parts of the hands, and on the indexes on the dial. The bracelets are slightly different on these. I mean, both of them are standard oyster bracelets, but the bracelet on the Submariner is all brushed, whereas on the GMT you've got brushed outer links and then polished center links. I like the bracelet on the GMT with that polished center link. I think it looks smart, but personally I prefer that subtle look with the brushed effect. I think it looks more refined, much sharper, a cleaner design. I think it's more like how a sports watch should look, a purpose utility piece. I think the GMT is edging on more of a dressy look with that shiny part. And I'm not a massive fan of super shiny watches, so that brushed effect on the Submariner looks really nice to me. I find the Submariner is a little bit more understated. I personally prefer the Submariner, but I also can appreciate the shiny center links. I think they look really nice with the watch. The clasp on the GMT is much smaller than the clasp on the Submariner, and that's because the Submariner has a glide lock clasp, meaning that you can adjust the size of the bracelet with ease and speed so that it can go over the top of a wetsuit just before you dive in. I much prefer that clasp because it's so much better for sort of everyday wear. If your wrist expands a little bit in hot weather, then you can adjust it super easily. Again, go check out the Submariner review if you haven't seen that already. On the GMT, this clasp is the standard oyster clasp. Really good clasp, they last for ages. I like the simple mechanics behind it, and it always feels really solid. The clasp on the GMT does have a easy link, which gives you 5mm of extension, but obviously not as much adjustability as the glide lock system on the Submariner. Setting the date on the Submariner is much easier than it is on the GMT, because there's actually a position on the crown where you can control just the date window alone, whereas on the GMT you have to cycle through the hours on that hour hand in order to change the date. That's a little bit tedious, but not a massive compromise. Changing the time on these watches is pretty similar though. Water resistance, the GMT is water resistant to 100 meters and the Submariner is water resistant to 300 meters. So it's obviously fit for purpose and it needs to have that water resistance, whereas the GMT doesn't necessarily need that. Both use the trip lock crown as well. These watches are so similar, I mean, it's pretty difficult to tell the difference between them from a distance. And to the untrained eye, they would probably look exactly the same. I mean, in terms of who they're better for, I think if you travel a lot, then the GMT is much better for you, because that feature is actually incredibly useful, that GMT feature. Having those dual time zones and being able to switch between them so easily as well. If you're making international calls a lot or dealing with people in other parts of the world for business, I'd say the GMT is an amazing little watch to have. I find it's much more useful than the Submariner, because the Submariner only really shows you elapsed time. I mean, maybe good for timing things, but you can also do the same on a GMT, so it's not really got an advantage over the GMT. I like the simplicity of the Submariner. It looks much more subtle and simple compared to the GMT. That GMT bezel is much louder and obvious than the Submariner. The Submariner is more refined and detailed and small. I also like the uncluttered look of the dial on the Submariner, whereas on the GMT you've obviously got that extra hand, which is not massively significant. I actually quite like that hand there, but I do like that simple appearance on the Submariner. I say one's not necessarily better than the other unless you're looking at it for purpose, and obviously the purpose of the GMT is to show you different time zones, and it's great at doing that. And Submariner, the purpose of that is showing you elapsed time, or how long you've dived for, and also showing you where to ascend through for decompression stops, and it's great at doing that. The fact that they were released 1 year after the other, I have a feeling, well, what it looks like to me is that Rolex took that Pan Am request to make a watch for the pilots, and I think they probably just took a Submariner case and put a GMT movement inside and put a new bezel on and then said, here you go. I could be totally wrong, but that's what it looks like to me. I personally prefer the history behind the Submariner. I think it's cool with the Bond history, and the people that worn it I think is more rich in history compared to the GMT. I like the aviation side, but I think the Submariner's got a more interesting background. I did used to prefer the GMT, and then I got a Submariner, and I actually really like the simplicity of the Submariner. It's an absolute classic. They're much more common than the GMT as well. And coming on to that, they actually hold their money better than the GMT. In fact, not just hold, they have better growth of money as well. The retail value of a Submariner is actually a little bit more than the GMT, even though GMT is obviously more complicated. And then the actual growth on the Submariner is better as well. They end up being worth more money than the GMT. It's a very hard decision to choose between the two of them. They've both got such subtle differences, but overall they're pretty much the same watch, just with a different movement. So overall, really comes down to personal preference. If you're looking for something that's going to grow in value better and is easier to sell, then I'd say the Submariner is your better option, because they're much easier to sell, they're slightly more common as well, and also they sell for better money. But the GMT is more practical for every day, and it could be a really, really useful tool. Thanks guys for watching. Comment in the comments down below. Let us know which one you prefer, the Submariner or the GMT, and stay tuned for more watch reviews. Also, we've got an update to the website coming with new rings, engagement rings, and a whole load of new stuff online.